Campaigning begins in Algeria. 5 candidates are on the ballot, but each has ties to the old guard, and protesters plan to boycott next month's election. The United Nations sounds the alarm after 4 more people die in Bolivia. A total of 23 have been killed in post-election violence. And high tide forecast at 160 centimeters this Sunday in Venice, the 3rd major flooding in the iconic city. Damage already estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of euros. And we begin in Algeria, where campaigning has officially begun for next month's presidential election. 5 candidates are on the ballot, but for many in the country, the poll is a sham. They fear the old guard is trying to cling to power. Demonstrations have gripped Algeria every week since February. Longtime leader Abdelaziz Bouteflika stepped down the following month. There's anger over unemployment, corruption, and an elderly elite seen as out of touch with the young. James Wilson has more.
One of these men will be the next president of Algeria. All are former ministers or supporters of former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, and whoever wins will have their legitimacy questioned. On the streets of Algeria, thousands came out to decry the election as a sham.
We want a civil state, not a military state. The government should all step down. No election. We deserve new faces, other than former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika government.
The protests are entering their 40th week. They began because of widespread popular discontent with President Bouteflika's long rule. In April, he resigned, and his brother and a number of former ministers have since been jailed for corruption. But the protesters fear the candidates will carry on his policies regardless. For one candidate, it's an issue that cannot be ignored.
The people came out into a popular movement with great strength and courage to face themselves in the first place. That is why I commit myself to understanding these changes.
Demonstrators believe that the lack of public enthusiasm will lead to an historically low turnout. With 3 weeks before polling day, it will be up to politicians and their supporters to prove them wrong.
Well, tension is mounting in Iran over fuel rationing and price hikes. 1 person was killed as protests erupted in over a dozen cities. While the surprise reforms are deeply unpopular, it's also created division between hardliners and moderate President Hassan Rouhani. Fraser Jackson reports.
Several Iranian cities have been engulfed by protests since Friday night, following a hike in fuel prices. In the capital, Tehran, protesters battled heavy snow and sub-zero temperatures to block a main highway in the city, leading to a massive traffic jam.
I was trying to take the Imam Ali Expressway, but it's not completely blocked, so I'm stuck. But I agree with the protests. I can't afford petrol that is 30,000 riyals per liter. Blocking the roads is our stand against the price hike.
We don't know how to deal with this economic crisis. This price hike is too much for us to afford.
The government has said that it won't allow the increase to have a knock-on effect on the cost of taxis or public transport. They project the increase will raise around $3 billion a year, money that will be used as subsidies for 60 million Iranians from lower-income households. But even the promise of an increase in benefits hasn't helped the government to win back the people's trust.
The government promised to stop inflation and give us more money. But now they've increased the petrol prices to pay for these benefits. It's going to be a disaster.
Fuel in Iran is currently much cheaper than it is in neighboring countries. Authorities say the price hike is an attempt to rein in the amount of petrol being smuggled out of the country.
And Iran's supreme leader saying that the gasoline prices increases should be implemented. Well, on the eve of the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, about 250,000 people gathered in Prague to give the prime minister an ultimatum: get rid of his businesses and media empire or resign. It was the second time since June that a crowd that size had rallied against him, both times considered the biggest anti-government protest since the end of communism. Nick Rushworth has more.
Around 250,000 people rallied, using the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the pro-democratic Velvet Revolution to apply pressure on Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. They're giving the populist billionaire till the 31st of December to get rid of his business and media empire. If not, they say, he should quit.
We don't agree with Andrej Babiš, and we don't like his kind of politics, because he is a corrupt person.
I think democracy is in danger because there are many people who are trying to twist it and set it according to their own rules. But that's not right.
The protesters want Babiš to sever ties with his Agrofert conglomerate, which is made up of more than 200 companies. The European Commission is looking into potential conflicts of interest related to farm subsidies. He says he's resolved any issues by moving his assets to trust funds. In another huge protest, the largest since 1989, 250,000 Czechs demonstrated in June as Babiš faced a criminal investigation over subsidy fraud. That probe was subsequently dropped. Babiš has been dubbed the Czech Donald Trump. Aside conflict of interest issues, he is a divisive force because prior to 1989 he was a Communist Party member and had contacts with the secret police.
Hong Kong riot police fired volleys of tear gas at protesters emerging from a campus. This Polytechnic University, where the blockade entered its 7th day on Sunday. Pro-democracy activists have concentrated efforts on key infrastructure sites and schools. The semi-autonomous region has been rocked by 5 months of protests, many worried by what they see as China's growing influence over the city. Well, Sri Lanka's former wartime defense chief, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, has claimed victory in the country's presidential election. He had campaigned on a tough security platform, and his main rival, Sajith Premadasa, already conceding. Rajapaksa oversaw the military defeat of Tamil separatists under his brother and then president 10 years ago. 269 people were killed earlier this year in Easter Sunday suicide bombings. That sapped investor confidence and hurt the tourism sector, pushing Sri Lanka into its worst economic slump in over 15 years. Well, 4 more people have died in post-election violence in Bolivia, raising the total number of dead to 23. There's been widespread unrest since Evo Morales won a 4th term in October amid disputed results. Since then, though, Morales was forced to resign, flee to Mexico, and was replaced by a self-appointed interim leader from the opposition. The UN Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, has said she's concerned that the situation in Bolivia could spin out of control. James Wilson reports.
Evo Morales may have fled Bolivia for Mexico, but his supporters are going nowhere. And some of them are in hospital after security forces in the city of Sacaba opened fire on a protest, injuring dozens and killing a number of people too.
So this is what they call democracy, killing us like we're nothing. They're not numbers, they're lives. Where is the justice?
For many indigenous Bolivians, the left-wing Morales is a hero. And the new interim president, Janine Áñez, is a racist and a right-wing usurper. 40% of the country's population is indigenous, and at first the new cabinet did not include a single indigenous person. Áñez has accused Morales of stoking tension from abroad, but her own focus is not entirely national. In a Skype call to Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaidó, she wished him well in his efforts to bring down his own government.
I think we have the same objective. I think there have been years of difficult struggle. We have tried to avoid at all costs this social convulsion because this is a citizen demand.
Fresh presidential elections are being planned, but the United Nations has warned La Paz that the violence could spin out of control and ultimately undermine the country's democracy.
Well, as you saw in that report, Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaido gaining some fresh backing. Meanwhile, his supporters took to the streets of Caracas, demanding the departure of embattled President Nicolas Maduro. But the turnout of about 5,000 people was far less than expected. The country has been locked in a power struggle since January, when Guaido declared himself interim leader. The ruling socialists and opposition have accused each other of being responsible for Venezuela's worst economic and social crisis in recent history. Well, over 100 people were arrested as familiar scenes played out in the French capital on the one-year anniversary of the Yellow Vest movement. Police fired tear gas and water cannons. Interior Ministry said 4,700 people turned out in Paris, 28,000 across the country. The protesters are angry over the rising cost of living and policies of President Emmanuel Macron that they say exacerbate the problem. Anka Ula reports.
1 year on, France's Yellow Vest protesters want to make sure they're not forgotten. Saturday's events began early with protests on the ring road surrounding Paris, tear gas and confusion spilling into the northwest of the city.
We arrived here and there was tear gas everywhere. It wasn't the people on the ring road getting gassed, it was us.
Though their numbers have dwindled in recent months, protesters hope this anniversary weekend can prove the movement still has momentum.
We're telling Macron that we're here. We're still here. The Yellow Vests are not dead because they tried everything to destroy the Yellow Vests, but the Yellow Vests are still here.
In southeastern Paris, the streets once again became corridors of violence. An all too familiar sight that's worn out law enforcement and residents since the movement began. The violence was cited by police when they decided to cancel Saturday's march at the last minute. At its peak last year, the Yellow Vests rallied 300,000 people across France, united by a common grievance, the rising cost of living, which they said was disproportionately affecting poor and rural communities. The outpouring of anger forced President Emmanuel Macron to reverse some of his tax plans and to offer 10 billion euros in measures that would benefit those with the lowest incomes. But many protesters say they've seen no concrete change in their lives.
Not at all. It's actually worse. I have more property taxes, more worries.
I can't take it anymore. I've got 4 children. The end of each month is hard. I just got my welfare check and my fridge is already empty.
The latest polls say that more than half of French people still support or have sympathy for the Yellow Vests, but 63% say they do not want the protests to begin again in earnest.
Venice is bracing for a third major flooding in less than a week. The crisis has already seen a state of emergency declared and 20 million euros in funds to tackle the devastation. But initial estimates say damages are already in the hundreds of millions. Nick Rushworth has the latest.
Knee-deep in St. Mark's Square, people fear a third flood with damage already estimated at 1 billion euros. The government has released emergency funding to tackle the devastation.
The Council of Ministers has allocated 20 million euros for the first emergency measures, which are for the rescue and assistance of the population and the restoration of public services.
The city is under a state of emergency. Venice's mayor says a final estimate of the damage would only be possible once the city dries out. He pointed to long-term concerns about climate change.
These are the consequences of the climate we have now, which is a crucial issue for the whole world, and for Venice even more so. That's why we asked the UN several times to consider the idea of creating a centre for the study of the consequences of climate change in Venice.
The city is made up of more than 100 islands. There are regular floods. Work on a multi-billion euro flood defence system began in 2003. But completion has been delayed by corruption scandals, cost overruns, as well as opposition from environmentalists who say the project could damage the region's fragile ecosystem.
That's the news for now. Please stay tuned to France 24.